Hey everyone, it's Friday here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got film analyst, Steelers extraordinaire, NFL extraordinaire, draft extraordinaire, Derrick Bell. He's joining the show. I want to talk to him about his recent evaluation on DK Metcalf and how he can fit the Steelers offense in a lot more ways people realize, and his outlook on cornerback and quarterback in the NFL draft, all here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. The all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week that we will show later in the show. As I said, we got Derrick Bell. He's back on the show. It's been a minute we've had Derrick, but you know Derrick. If you don't, you better know him. If you in the Steelers content, this man does draft content, film content, all the stuff. He breaks things down. Derrick, how you been, man?
I'm doing well, man. It's good to get together, even though we're not doing it with pizza right in front of us, right? Like we did a couple weeks ago in Indianapolis.
Yes,
but I'm excited to get on here, talk Steelers, talk NFL draft, man. Two of my favorite topics. So yeah, it's good to catch up with you, brother.
Absolutely. Same here. We had some deep dish pizza in Indianapolis after the combine. That was good times. But Derrick, let's get into something that I think did change everything we didn't know was going to happen at the combine, which was we would be talking about DK Metcalf. And you recently did a piece on for SteelersNow.com as well as for your own YouTube page, looking at how he fits so much more than just a deep ball go get him guy. Can you explain what people are overlooking the most that DK Metcalf is going to bring to Arthur Smith's offense?
Yeah, I think that DK is a player that can often get like just mischaracterized as like this big bodied, contested catch threat. And I just don't think that that's really the player that he is on film. You talk about like X receivers, the qualifications you need to play X in the NFL. DK just absolutely destroys press coverage, does a really good job like using his hands to get people off his frame. Like he has a good release package. Obviously you get the speed and the acceleration to like take cornerbacks over the top. And just the explosive plays that he can generate in that regard are always like near the tops in the league. But some of the other stuff that when I went through his film evaluation, I was pretty perplexed by the way that Seattle used him last year. The lack of in-breaking routes, which are like, the slant route is kind of his changeup. If the fastball is kind of the non-route of the go ball, the slant route is really like his next best route. And they pretty much like took that out of his repertoire last year, which is really perplexing to me. The year before, 2 years ago, I think he had like 18 catches or something like that on slant routes. Last year, it was 4. And it's just really a weird way to use a player like that. But yeah, I mean, DK, the explosive plays, I mean, there's a lot of things that he brings to the table just as someone that can tilt the coverage and also like draw the other team's opposing best cornerback and, make things easier, not only for the quarterback, but the other wide receivers in the room.
Well, that leads to my next question about George Pickens. One of the things that I had to kind of combat against when they first signed DK Metcalf is this doesn't make any sense because how are you going to put they're the same guy? Like, they're not the same guy. And I said that from the jump. But I want people to hear from you. How different are these two guys as wide receivers, and how can they function on the field at the same time while both being major threats?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are very different receivers. I think the usage between both of them does have overlap. They're both vertical threats, but with Pickens, you're really looking at the above the rim ability. Like he's somebody with outstanding like body control. I do think he's got a little bit more lower body flexibility as a route runner, and that's kind of where I've been so bullish on like his route running potential, even when he was coming out of Georgia. And then with Metcalf, it's really just like pure speed. He's actually a guy who doesn't really necessarily feel all that comfortable having to like contort his body on those back shoulder fades, which Pickens does a really good job of. And also like just his contested catch numbers over the years have been really underwhelming. And that's kind of what I go back to, like with some of the mischaracterization of him as a player. I think some people think that he's just this big bodied contested catch receiver who can't get open. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think, he's not very good with the ball in the air, but he actually does get open, especially if you allow him to do the things that he can do. And I think that there is a world that those two can coexist. Of course, it does depend on like who the quarterback is, and it's probably going to require some further development and some extra steps from both of those guys, honestly, in order to make it work. But these are good problems to have. I think that you and I would be remiss if we didn't point out the fact that like we'd rather deal with these type of problems than like, having to play a guy like Van Jefferson's, 500 plus snaps or something like that again next year. I mean, good players, your offensive coordinator is going to have to figure it out. I'm not saying it's going to be easy or seamless, but it definitely can work.
Absolutely. I mean, as Mike Tom would say, those are good problems to have. You'd want to have those
sure.
on your side. Now, I want you to talk more about that evolution aspect, because that was the other part that I thought was really good that you talked about in your stuff, was what DK Metcalf has to do next as a development, because, players, they develop throughout their careers. And now this is the stage where DK Metcalf can be at home. He knows he's not going nowhere for 4 or 5 years. This can be his place to become an elite wide receiver. I think he's a very good wide receiver. I don't think he's gotten to the elite category yet. What does he need to do to get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could maybe some positive regression in the contested catch department. Those things can kind of come and go, but I do think we have enough of a sample size to say that that's probably not going to be like, a strength like you would maybe assume it is, like with somebody with his size and length profile. I think for me with DK, I just think honing in on the details would go a long way for him in terms of like you talk about reaching that next step, getting into. I don't see him as like a tier 1 type of guy, like the AJ Browns, Justin Jeffersons, like those type of guys who are just like so well-rounded without any real weaknesses. There are some weaknesses in DK's game, I think, that are just relative to like, his physical profile. He's a little bit high cut. Like he's never going to be able to run. Like he does run a pretty stripped down route tree because of that. But having said, like, I think if he just like kind of cleaned up a little bit on the details, avoiding drifting on the routes, like that was one of the big things, like just having better awareness and zone coverage, how to work back to the football a little bit more, make yourself available to the quarterback. There's other things too, like what we've talked about with previous Steelers wide receivers, right? Like, can we clean up the penalties? Like he's always like near the top in the league in that regard too. So I think there's more on the tree to grab onto if like he really commits himself to like, committing towards the details. But I do think that even if we're talking about the ceiling, I do think it's important to mention the floor, because this is a guy who's been, like a top 20 wide receiver, like pretty much throughout his career. He's proven he's been really durable, been able to stay healthy and produce those explosive plays in a league that's really trying to do whatever they can to like combat those type of opportunities.
Now, my next question kind of leads into the putting this together. Assuming Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback in 2025, are there things they can do that Arthur Smith can do that can open both of these guys up, that can help develop them to be more like the receivers that their potential shows they can be, versus kind of having a lot of chemistry issues and not knowing how these guys and how the whole offense should fit together with those two guys as playmakers?
Yeah, I think the chemistry thing is an interesting point to bring up. It's unfortunately an answer that I don't think any of us really have right now. Rodgers is somebody like he likes his guys. That's why he tries to bring his guys along with him to his stops. And he likes that familiarity, the hand signals, all those things. So I'm optimistic that these guys could get on the same page with him, maybe quicker than the guys with the Jets did last season. But having said that, like it is going to revolve on like the details, like being where you are on your landmarks on time. But I don't think it's not hard to imagine, Rodgers, like one of the things that he's always done a really good job of, like simple stuff, like the back shoulder fades. Like him and Devontae Adams have always had incredible chemistry there. And you look at Pickens, and that's something that he does really, really well. And then I just mentioned like the in breakers with Metcalf and like those slant patterns against press coverage. Like Rodgers has that lightning quick release to where like he doesn't even need his feet set to kind of get the ball out to him in stride and things like that. And even there's other like simple things that I talked about just like in the video in terms of, Rodgers, one of the things that I've always admired about his game is like he's just really smart, like a lot smarter than I think people give him credit for because of how athletically gifted he is with the arm talent and everything. But, when you get off coverage, the whole thing with DK is like you want teams to press, you want them to play man coverage. Like teams are scared of doing that. They play a lot of too high, they play a lot of off zone coverage because quite frankly, not a lot of teams have like a number one corner that can run with him vertically. But just like simple stuff as far as like if you get a cornerback playing 8 yards off, Rodgers is one of those guys who will like quickly alert and just like raise up off the line of scrimmage and toss the ball out to him. And then from there, it's like have your 190-pound corner come try to tackle this 230-pound wide receiver. And you kind of force defenses to play into your hand like that way. So, I mean, I think that there's obviously some question marks in terms of like how it could all fit, but there are elements of it that I think get you excited as well.
Absolutely. We'll explore more of that as we get more into the year. We have plenty of time to look at that, but I want to get Derrick's thoughts on draft questions because that's something that Derrick does a great job on. We'll get to his thoughts on cornerback next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter, Derrick Bell, stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Nissan. The Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, we'll be taking a look at our draft prospects to pick one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcased the strength and power needed to push the Steelers forward as we look ahead to next season. This week's Armada and clear-cut Player of the Week is Michigan defensive tackle Kenneth Grant. I've stated I love the idea of the Steelers getting this guy. The Steelers need a stud, and he is an obvious stud in the defensive tackle prospects. If he falls to 21, Omar Khan could place a big mover in the middle of the Steelers defensive line who takes a heavy-duty workload to stop the run, just like the Nissan Armada conquers the road with capability and confidence. When it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what I think Kenneth Grant can do with the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's clear that our Player of the Week is out here ready to conquer the road and ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter here with Derrick Bell. Derrick, I want to get into the cornerback class with you. Now, as I said before the show, you were like the first Steelers person that I saw be like Azareye'h Thomas, Florida State. That's the guy right there. Look at the stuff that he adds up there together. But I think this is a good cornerback class. There's guys in the first round, guys in the second round. There's guys that could be available late day 2 that could be really interesting here. But I wanted to get your sense if you were to forget Travis Hunter because he's going top 5. But when you get to the Will Johnson level of things, where do you put Azareye'h Thomas with Will Johnson, Jahdae Barron, your Siobhan Revels, Maxwell Hairston, and Trey Amos is out there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely higher on him than consensus. He's well within like my top 5 corners in the class and somebody that I pretty much had like in the first round conversation, really since I laid eyes on him early in the evaluation. I think with Thomas, you just go back and watch the film last year. First off, he's only 20 years old. So I just see a patient, I see a physical press cornerback. He just suffocates dudes on the boundary. It's a little bit like what Joey Porter Jr. did at Penn State, just dominating with size, length, physicality, those types of things. He does a good job like getting a contact key on receivers. You know, nothing's easy with him. And I just think that when you go look at his film, he just has more like true one-on-one reps and like those types of settings than really anybody else in the class. Obviously, the 40-yard dash was underwhelming at his pro day. That's going to be a big talking point and something I anticipate probably hurting his draft stock to where he's taken probably later than I personally would value him. But at the same time, like the speed was more like above average than a real concern for me on film. So it doesn't really affect my evaluation too much. But yeah, I mean, like to be completely honest with you, he's still probably going to be around like a top 20 prospect for me, which is quite a bit higher than I think the consensus has him right now.
I think that's the thing is that it depends on what you like at cornerback. You know, I see a physical guy who can play press man, who could use his hands in a smart way. And I think that if you pair that long term with Joey Porter Jr., assuming that Joey Porter Jr. becomes the guy that they really want him to be, if you compare that together, that can make for a really tough pair of cornerbacks for the long term, where your receivers are going to have to fight to get off the ball. They're dealing with guys that are sticky downfield. These guys are swatting the ball away. And I think that also plays into the hands of how the Steelers have traditionally wanted their cornerbacks to play. You know, you look at the Steelers over the years, Minkah Fitzpatrick, when his interceptions were up, it's because the Steelers cornerbacks were like Joe Hayden, Steven Nelson. They were plastering guys up the sidelines, and it created opportunities for the safeties to make plays on the ball. And that's where I see those two guys could mix here. But let's say Thomas isn't available. Who are some of the guys that you look at the Steelers should have very close eyes on if, say, the first round, if you're at 21 and someone becomes available? Are you in the trade up mentality for a guy like a Barron or a Will Johnson? Are you willing to stay put if he's like 3-4 spots away?
Yeah, it's funny. We've kind of talked a little bit on my channel just about, you know, different. out of the box scenarios, and Jahdae Barron was somebody that I brought up as kind of an outside the box scenario for them. And the thing I like most about Barron is, like, I think he's within that consideration if he does fall to 21, just because I love the versatility. This is a guy who's played downbacker. He's played safety. He's played outside cornerback last season. He had like 5 picks and I think 9 pass breakups or something like that. But what I love about Barron most is just the physicality and the anticipation. He does a really good job, like, anticipating throws underneath. I think he's an incredibly smart defender. When you look at, I personally like him most in the slot. That's kind of where I see his transition to the next level. I love his ability to get off blocks. He can run the alley. He plays the run extremely well. So a lot of characteristics of what I look for in that position. And then you mentioned Will Johnson. I think there's been some concerns, I think, about him just in terms of, like, what's he going to run if he runs the 40. He was a little bit banged up last year. And to be honest with you, like, I thought the film last year was definitely a step off from, like, what I'm accustomed to seeing from him, because Johnson was one of those guys that when he stepped foot on the field as a freshman, when he was, 18, 19 years old, I immediately was like, he drew my attention and I wasn't even trying to study him. I was looking at other players. And I just think that the technical prowess from him, he's long, he's got great size, he's got good closing bursts, he's opportunistic, especially when throws get kind of patrolled out there to the flat areas. And I like what Johnson brings to the game too. I'm just kind of curious on, like, whether or not the Steelers view this as a high enough priority, or if they're just going to try to band-aid over this with kind of Darius Slay and then maybe pursue somebody in this type of range next year.
No, that's where I'm at too. Like, I get that Darius Slay is a stopgap guy, and that's kind of how they've treated the cornerback position, right? That's what they did with Dante Jackson. It's what they did with Patrick Peterson. It just seems to be their thing until they find CB1 for the future, and then maybe they find CB2 for the future. But cornerback is a position that's been of growing importance in the NFL. Now, granted, I do think that, like, if I had to choose if you were to fix one of these positions, if you were to get an all pro D tackle versus an all pro corner, man, that'd be a tough choice for me as a Steelers evaluator to be like, hey, like, if they could get that stud that locks down the run up the middle and frees up Patrick Queen and everybody to roam behind them to stop the run and in the pass, that could do so much for what the Steelers want to do. But if they could have a supreme corner out of this draft class that could pair with Joey Porter Jr. and Joey Porter Jr. becomes the corner that you drafted him to be, those are things that the Steelers really have not had in their time, even under Mike Tomlin, when he's had really good corners. Steven Nelson and Joe Hayden, they were good cornerbacks, but they were good, like, older veteran cornerbacks that weren't homegrown, and they weren't all pro. They were just solid dudes that were on the plus side of their careers. I think that's where things could get really interesting if they get aggressive. But let's say they don't get aggressive. Let's say they wait until that 3rd round pick, or there's a trade back and they get maybe a little bit earlier 3rd round pick, maybe a late 2nd round pick, something along those lines. Who are those day 2 corners that you're keeping a very close eye on outside of maybe Azareye'h Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, Savon Revel is a guy from East Carolina that I think is really intriguing. Unfortunately, he suffered an ACL injury in October, but I just saw a video, I think it was about a week ago, of him running on the treadmill. So it seems like he's going to be full speed ahead. Revel to me reminds me a little bit of Antonio Cromartie. So just like that type of, like, physical specimen. I don't know that the tape is as clean as a guy like Thomas's was even before the injury, but the ball production is better. And I just think that there's a ton of upside just with the way that this dude moves. Obviously, he's going to face a steep, like, uptick in competition, but this dude can really roll. I mean, you're talking about a guy that can be in, like, a bail technique with his back to the sideline. You can get those deep crossers off play action that everybody in the NFL runs. But there was examples of him in college, like, undercutting those routes, which is just, like, really, really rare territory in terms of athleticism. So Revel would be a guy I would expect that the Steelers, or I was kind of hoping that they'd have an interest in Jacob Parrish from Kansas State. That was another guy that I kind of identified as someone who can play outside, can play inside a little bit, gives you a little bit of versatility on the back end. He tested really well, so I think his stock is up as well. And Maxwell Harrison from Kentucky, I think other draft evaluators have him a little bit maybe higher than I do. But if you're just like want to take a swing on somebody with a lot of athleticism, I think his recovery speed is extremely, extremely good. I think the timing, playing the ball at the catch points, a plus as well. So there was some really good, like, high moments on film to kind of get latched onto if that's the route they go.
No, yeah, I'm with you on Hairston. I like some of the things he does, but he's really thin. He's light, and like sometimes like with the way the Steelers want to play at corner, I think like that wouldn't be the right mix. Now, if he somehow turned into that guy that could be just a playmaker on the ball, opposite of the physical corner, that'd be interesting. That'd be an interesting dynamic. But from guys like maybe Notre Dame's Benjamin Morrison, like there are guys out there that I'm glad you pointed out. Siobhan Rivell, because I think that he's pretty talented. I also like Darian Porter. The idea of a Porter and Porter secondary, but like when you're talking about Azareye'h's testing, Darian Porter lit that up. And when he did that, when he did his con, I was like, oh, okay, yeah. So he is that guy. And he's 6'4", he can fly, he can run. I'm kind of with you, man. Like, as much as, especially in the third round, you're looking at running back prospects. You could maybe get a quarterback, for the man. If one of those corners could be there, or if you trade back in the first round and it helps you get higher up in day 2 to get one of these corners, I think that could really put a nice piece on top of this class that would allow it to be much more of a complete class that can help get them to where they need to be when ultimately I think they make their bigger move to get their franchise quarterback next year.
For sure. And I like what you mentioned about just like the run support stuff, because that is like super important when it comes to like playing this position, the way that NFL offensive systems and ecosystems are like really targeting cornerbacks in a run game. Like we've seen it show up in the worst of times at times here in Pittsburgh with guys, not being so willing to come down and play the run. But that's one of the things I really like about Revel is I think that he is a really, really physical run defender. He sometimes will take some poor angles, but he is willing to come down and tackle and to hit. He's a little bit high-legged, but I do like what he brings to the table in that regard. So there's a lot of good options. I'm just kind of curious, like you said, if they're going to be able to find a trade back partner and acquire another day 2 pick to where maybe they can make a swing at this position.
Hey, that was just the episode I did yesterday talking about trade back partners getting to the back part of the first round.
Would be great.
It would be very interesting to see what the Steelers could pull off, maybe finding a way to get back that second round pick, or at least get an early third round pick that could change the trajectory of the type of players they can get. But when you talked about cornerback, we got to talk about the other position, quarterback, because as I've said, this is not the franchise quarterback draft class year. I do think this is the backup quarterback class here, and there's plenty of guys that can fit that bill. I want to talk about who those guys are and who he has his eyes on. Next with Derrick Bell. Stick here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We'll be right back. We're back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Derrick Bell. Derrick, let's talk about quarterback. Now, that's always the funny thing. When people say quarterback and cornerback, sometimes people get lost in the sauce of what you're talking about. We're talking about the throwers of the football, the ones that are trying to avoid the cornerbacks that we just talked about. So, real quick, before we get into all these day 2 prospects, Derrick, are you on the Shedeur Sanders train, or do you think I think Shedeur Sanders, if you pick him day 2, and you don't have supreme plans for him to be the ultimate guy, that's fine. But there are people saying he should go top 10. The Steelers should take him at 21. I'm not on that train. Where do you sit on him?
Yeah, the thing is, I've seen Adam Schefter kind of float the Steelers as like a Sanders landing spot. I think for me, there hasn't been any smoke or link that I know of. And I just think that, if the Steelers are going to take a quarterback in round 1, I think that it'll be the same thing we saw kind of in 2022, where they're going to send the house to the pro day. They're going to invite him to the facility. And like, until that stuff happens, I don't necessarily see that link. But with Sanders, I think you love just like the sharpshooter accuracy, like to really to the first and second level. He could throw the deep ball as well, but I think first and second level accuracy is precise. I mean, he can really pace people, especially over the middle of the field. I think that he was in a truly disastrous system in Colorado, despite playing with what I think is by far the best player in the NFL draft, Travis Hunter. But I just think that the ecosystem kind of formed some bad habits for him, just in terms of like pocket, like having to consistently drift out of there. But, I think with Sanders, the question really is just surrounds, the upside. Like, I think that the tools are pretty much below average for the position. And I think if you're going to take a guy within the top 5, top 10, like you were saying, I think that you would like to just have like more belief in like those sorts of things. I think that the drive velocity isn't necessarily there with him. And I also just don't think that he's going to be able to be like much of a creator outside of structure at the next level. So, yeah, I mean, Sanders was a guy that I had a second round grade on. I like the player. I think that he can be a starting quarterback in the NFL, especially if he lands in the right system, one of these like turn the back play action systems. But I'm not as bullish on like the upside.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm not, again, like I think that he does some things very well. His accuracy, his throwing motion is very consistent.
Repeatable.
It's just like he just bang. It's so consistent,
Mm-hmm.
and that to me is when I look for that. That's when I see precision as a quarterback thrower. But like you said, like oftentimes I see him do that back spin out of the pocket, and I'm like, oh God, that's Kenny Pickett. Oh God, like not again. No, you can't do this. So I look at that and I'm just like and again, I don't think he's a bad player. I have a hard time betting on that to be the franchise guy. And there's always guys that surprise me. There's guys that we all miss as when it comes to the quarterback position, but that happens. So let's get down past the Shedeur Sanders guys, and I'll even say past Jaxson Dart, because some people have him as a first round pick. I do not. I think that he's right in the, if he falls to the range of the Steelers in the third round, then we'll talk. But where do you put, if you were to throw out Sanders and Ward, between Jaxson Dart, Jalen Milroe, your Will Howards and Tyler Shough? If you were to look at those four, and I guess we'll throw in a fifth, like Quinn Ewers, where do you see those guys stacking up against each other? Because Mike Tomlin, he noted at the owners meetings that he liked his trips to Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Texas, looking at quarterbacks, and those, of course, are Riley Leonard, Quinn Ewers, and Will Howard. Where do you see that group of guys stacking up against each other?
Yeah, I mean, man, it's a class. It's a class. That's all I'll say about it. But I mean, for me, Jalen Milroe was my QB3. It was more like about a late second kind of type of range. Obviously, with Milroe, pretty straightforward scouting report, right? Like complete freak show. He's got the howitzer for an arm. He can throw the deep ball. Really gifted athlete, especially as a runner. He destroys pursuit angles. Everything in the QB run game's on the table with him, but it's just, there are so many things like inside the pocket. I do think some of his habits got better this past season, but just the overall inconsistencies and need to clean up some of the accuracy stuff. And he's definitely a project in that regard, that you're trying to shoot for some of that upside. But I do like the character stuff that I've heard through various channels, and I'm kind of a believer in that aspect of it. In terms of Dart, I agree with you. I think that the train's kind of just like left the station, and I'm hanging out. I'm not jumping on that one. I do think like he's incredibly charismatic. Like he's somebody that's going to like really rally an offense behind him. I really liked just his willingness to push the ball down the field. He's a really tough son of a gun, man. Like he will take big hits as a scrambler. He'll like try to lower his shoulder. Like he stays in the pocket and will like just stand in the barrel of fire and throw the ball. I like the touch over the middle of the field. I just think that the processing is just so slow. And I guess one of the things that I kind of differ from the consensus, just like listening to other draft evaluators, I just don't think the tools are nearly as special or even like as good as like everybody else does. So I'm a little bit less high on the upside. I think the other two guys that you kind of mentioned, Will Howard, there's a lot to like with Howard in terms of like when everything is good around him. I think that when the pocket's clean and Howard can kind of stand in there and deliver, I think the intermediate accuracy really stood out with Howard just in terms of pushing the ball there in that area of the field. And I also think like with a class that has a lot of quarterbacks that, drift and like get too much depth in the pocket, Howard does a good job stepping up in the pocket. So I like that about him. I just really find him, and like the term that I've like been using to describe him is like, I think he's a really robotical player. And I just think that that's kind of a red flag for me at the NFL level, because it's always messy in the pocket. You're always going to have to make these like tight, subtle, shifty movements up and around pressure, up and around bodies flying at you when those live bullets get really rolling. And I just felt like Howard, anytime he was kind of pushed off his spot, I felt like his level, his creativity, his ability as a thrower really dipped. So yeah, I mean, I'm not all that high on the quarterback class in general. I don't even know really all the names in next year's class, but I wouldn't be banging the table for the Steelers to take one at 21.
Yeah, I'm the same as you here. Again, I look at this class like the backup quarterback class. Like again, Jalen Milroe, there's a chance that if Jalen Milroe just puts it together, which just put together is minimizing it. If he does a lot, if he develops really well in his early years in the NFL, he could become a serious threat. He could do some really special things, and that's interesting. But a lot of these guys, like the Will Howard, like you said, Will Howard has a lot of problems to his game. But you know what? he reminds me of what Mason Rudolph could have been in the NFL and is in the NFL right now, because not Mason Rudolph, he is a good backup quarterback. That's what I see Will Howard as. That's what I see as guys like Riley Leonard, Quinn Ewers. They all have problems with their game, but there's elements of their game that I think that if you kept them around and put them in an offense and let them get used to things, you can work around them and say, hey, you're a temporary stopgap fix for when our starter gets back, or you're the bridge guy while we're like where the Steelers are right now, where they're waiting to find their new franchise guy. Yeah. I think this is that class of those guys, and you never know when you're going to need those guys. Case in point, how many times has Mason Rudolph come to the rescue for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
Sure. Yeah, he's coming to rescue right now. I mean, he's the only quarterback really on the roster, right? But yeah, I mean, I'm completely with you. I think that maybe one of the more like interesting players in the draft, and like he's somebody like the closer we get to the draft, the more like I feel like crazy some of these like quarterback discussions get. A guy that I really liked early in the process was like Tyler Shough from Louisville. I am a Louisville alum, so I got the chance to see him play in person last year. But, you know, Shough was like, okay, this is a really fun, like if he makes it to day 3, I would be all over this as like a developmental prospect, because he's got this like really powerful arm. He's got the prototypical size. He's got the drive velocity. He could throw it through a key sized hole. And also there's a lot of, you know, I think minor stuff that matters a lot to me that he kind of already possesses. Like he used the cadence at the line of scrimmage. Like he's comfortable getting under center. He's been in multiple like pro style systems. They even trusted him so much, granted, because he's like 25 years old. They trusted him so much last year to like make checks at the line of scrimmage, not just to get them in the right protection, but like giving him run and pass calls. Like he even talked to me about at the combine how he checked into several of their like big runs last season. And that was like one of the more like things he was like proud of. And so there's a lot to like in terms of like just like his arm and like the build and the tools and things like that. My concern with him is that I think there's just some scar tissue there in terms of like all the injuries that he's accumulated over the course of his career. He's had so many season-ending injuries that there just seemed like at times that there was like an unwillingness to like step up in the pocket and kind of take a hit. And, you know, that's the part you mentioned earlier, like nobody's perfect when it comes to evaluating this position. Even NFL teams are really bad at it. And I just think it's because the environment in college is just so much different than it is in the NFL. I mean, in the NFL, it's got to be, you know, you pretty much have to have the ball out on your back foot. Everything happens in, 2.8 seconds. And in college, you know, you're back there and you have this huge bubble around you all the time when you're trying to make these throws. And it's tough, but, you know, Shough would be another guy that I would throw in there. Like if he was there in the 3rd round, I could definitely get on board with making that type of investment just to see if there's something there.
Right. And I don't care about his age at this point outside of the injuries, you know, because again, I'm not, if I'm drafting Shough, it's not to make him the franchise guy, it's to make him the backup guy. And there's value in that. But I like in what you say about the way that he's able to conduct an offense, the level of things he's able to do at the collegiate level. That's more like what the Steelers were supposed to be getting in Kenny Pickett, where this guy who's going to come in, not have to be told a whole lot, not have to, you know, redo things a whole lot, just understand this is what we got to do to make these things work in an NFL offense. I think that's where he could be an interesting prospect guy. So I think, again, you go from all these different guys and the things that they bring, from toughness in the pocket to understanding the game to amazing athleticism. There are plenty of good backup quarterback options anywhere from the 3rd to, I'd say, the 4th and 5th rounds, where depending on where some of these guys land, because quarterback can always be weird with when people want to take a shot and when people don't want to take a shot on the quarterback. That's where you go get your guys in this year's class. And Derrick, I think that if the Steelers land one of those guys we named here, you're most likely you have Aaron Rodgers, you have Mason Rudolph, who's on a 2-year deal, and you have that rookie there. That I think is a good stage setter for next year, being able to go be aggressive and try to get your franchise guy. And then you have a veteran behind him, and then you'll have a second year player who is already slated to be a backup. There's not questioning if that guy's going to take the starting job off of the starter that you're drafting. And I think that could be an ideal situation for the Steelers to actually build a quarterback room and an offense.
Yeah, and I mean, I know there's like people of both thoughts, right? Like some people hate that idea, some people love that idea. I just think, you know, a 3rd round grade, like if you have a 3rd round grade on a player in the NFL, that's a developmental prospect. Like ideally, that person does develop into a starter, right? Like you want to try to get 3 starters per draft class. That's kind of like the old adage in the scouting community. But at the same time, like, you know, the Steelers don't have a quarterback right now. So like even if we assume that Rodgers is going to be here for this year, it's going to be for this year at the most, right? So until you have a quarterback, like one of the things that I really strongly believe is like, if you don't have a quarterback that you really believe in, you got to just keep taking swings. And like, I completely know what the numbers say about like, you know, quarterbacks drafted out of the first round, the success rate on those guys is super poor. Like I said earlier, like the hit rate on first round quarterbacks isn't good either, but you have to, because of the importance of the position, you got to keep taking swings, even if, you know, they're more than likely going to end up being backups. And I don't think it necessarily prohibits them from taking another guy next year. I pointed out, I actually was talking about this on my channel not too long ago, but I actually pointed out some examples of teams taking like day 2 quarterbacks. Like Malik Willis was a guy that this happened to. He got taken in the 3rd round. There was some like organizational stuff where they didn't necessarily align with him as a player. They moved quickly on to like, they took Will Levis the very next year. Same thing with that happened with I think it was Matt Corral. They took Bryce Young because they got the top pick the next year. And then I think like today's news even could be a good precursor to that conversation, right? Joe Milton gets picked in the 7th round. He has a uneventful preseason. He plays really well in the season finale against backups, and you're able to get a 5th round pick for him. So you trade a 7th round pick for a 5th round pick. And I think that that's good organizational process. In my opinion, even if it's like, you know, you're continuing to search for the guy. And I think that the biggest thing is like, you just have to continue to take shots at that position.
Absolutely. He's Derrick Bell, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you check out his content. He does great work on the Steelers, NFL draft. Derrick, let people that can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. At Steelers_DB on Twitter and YouTube. And you can follow all of my written work at SteelersNow.com. I just finished my top 15 rankings for the NFL draft at the receiver position. So you can check that out. That'll be up here shortly. So
absolutely. Check out Derrick's work. He does a great job. Derrick, thank you for joining us. And thank you all for joining us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, all the social medias. Same handle everywhere, at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com, and find me here every day, Monday through Friday on the Pittsburgh Steelers, right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. A reminder, Mock Draft Monday's coming, so get your picks in. Check out my Twitter, my Blue Sky, and the Locked On Steelers Facebook group for your chance to get your picks in there to get your chance on the show. We'll see you here Monday on the Locked On Steelers podcast.